Indeed, I greet all of you, brothers and sisters, on this glorious feast day. The Patriarch quoted the epistle of St. Paul the Apostle to the Romans. St. Paul wrote several verses about the power of the love of God. And he said, nothing can separate us from the love of God. Not tribulations, not prison, not stripes, not beating, not sickness. Nothing can separate us from the love of God. We have to remember, St. Paul wrote this. St. Paul, who was an ardent and fervent supporter of the Jewish temple, was a well-learned and highly respected Pharisee. He was well-versed, probably the best versed in Judaic law than anyone of his contemporaries. And he saw on the road to Damascus the brilliant light of Christ and was converted and believed in the risen Christ. But with that belief and with that testimony and with his preaching of the risen Christ, he suffered greatly. He went to many different lands. The New Testament is composed in large part by his letters, by his epistles to various countries, to various communities that were beginning to grow as Christians. And he suffered sickness and sorrow, hunger and thirst, cold and heat, shipwreck, imprisonment. His life was turned upside down from someone who was one of the most respected members of the community to a downcast prisoner, locked in the prisons of Rome, only to be beheaded. His world was turned upside down. And he writes, nothing can separate us from the love of God. He's saying two things with those words. He's reminding us about the power of faith. That it is our faith in our Lord Jesus Christ, risen from the dead, that is the foundation of our life. And secondly, he's saying that God will never, ever abandon us, no matter how dark our days may be. The disciples experienced this. A couple of times they were out on the Sea of Galilee, and the storms rose up. There was one time when even Christ was in the same boat as them, down below deck, sleeping, and they were afraid. And he said to them, "Why were you afraid?" And he calmed the seas and tamed the winds, and they felt safe. Of course, the disciples' world was turned upside down with his crucifixion. And this day, the third day, they were hidden in the upper room. We'll hear about it in tonight's Vesper service, the Gospel reading from John. How they were fearful. They heard all these stories that people saw Christ risen from the dead. But they were fearful for their lives because everyone in Jerusalem were searching for anyone who confessed Christ to kill them. And Christ appeared to them, and they were behind locked doors. And they became even more afraid. They were even more afraid because their spiritual world was now shaken. They saw Christ being arrested. St. John, the theologian, stood at the cross of Christ. He saw Christ die before his very eyes. And here he is, with the holes in his hands and his feet. And they were shooken to the core. But it wasn't until Christ said, "Peace be unto you," that they became calm. And with the peace of Christ, they embraced him. They embraced the resurrection. And they embraced their calling to go out and preach, and became very courageous and brave. And with great zeal preached the resurrection of Christ to many different lands. In many ways, our world has become very different. I don't know if we can say our world has been turned upside down, like that of the apostles. But we are shaken. We are shaken by the change in our daily routine. Nobody likes to have their daily routine changed. Nobody. We all know this from Great Lent, how we become irritated and frustrated. Patience just goes out the window. We don't like it when our world changes. But on top of that, we see the numbers of tens of thousands of people dying in our own country. And yes, every day people die. There are more people who die from other diseases, and the millions of babies who die by abortion. We don't blink an eye. But because this can touch us, it shakes our world. We become suspicious over everything. Is that door handle clean? Did I wash my hands enough? I can't get too close to this person. Our fear has overtaken us, just like the disciples who hid themselves in the upper room. Their physical world, that of the disciples, of course changed. They left their families behind, their professions. The fishermen sold everything they had, their boats, their nets. Naturally, their physical life changed, but also their spiritual life changed for the better. And they were willing to sacrifice the physical for the sake of the spiritual. So we should not let this fear of being infected ruin or control our life. Because Christ is risen. Because Christ promises to be with us if we open our hearts to him and follow his commandments. He promises to be with us in all kinds of afflictions and distress. He will never forsake us. He says, "I am with you always, even to the end of the world." And so, brothers and sisters, yes, we are not together physically here with us, but we are together in our prayers, in our concern for one another, in the many phone calls and teleconferences and virtual meetings and emails and text messages that we send to one another. We share our feelings, our greetings, our worries, our anxieties. We request prayers from each other. Our interactions continue. And may our relationships continue to be strengthened. so that when the time does come, and it will come, when we are granted to be together again in God's holy temple, we will appreciate it far more than we ever did. We will embrace each other far more sincerely than we ever did. And we will love each other with much more attention and more genuinely than we ever did. Through all of this, we'll understand what is most important. And we also are experiencing in life, not just by reading, but we experience now that nothing can separate us from the love of God. Nothing. Remember that. In your darkest days, God will never be separated from you if you run to Him. Remember that when the temptations abound and you become lost. Remember that when you're seeking God's will and you don't know what to do. When the stress returns, and when the traffic returns, and the work concerns return, and all of the normal daily stress and vanities return, remember that nothing can separate us from the love of God. Nothing can separate us because Christ has defeated the enemy of all enemies completely, wholly, and without reservation. He defeated death, and life now reigns. Life of holiness, life of righteousness, life of grace, life of faith and love. If we embrace all of that, then truly, even though our physical world may be turned upside down, our spiritual world will be firm and sure, because nothing can separate us from the love of God. Christ is risen. Christos voskresie. Christos anesti. Thank you all. Thank you, choir, for your dedication.